The room went dead silent the moment Laura Bennett walked in. 3 nurses clustered around the break room table, scattered like startled birds, their coffee cups abandoned mid-sip, chairs scraping backward with practiced urgency. Their laughter, bright and deliberate just seconds before, evaporated into the fluorescent hum overhead. One of them, the intern named Marcus, actually stood up. The others didn't bother with subtlety. They left. Not together. Not at once. But within 30 seconds, the break room held only Laura and the smell of burnt coffee and the lingering ghost of a conversation that had stopped existing the moment she entered. She didn't acknowledge the exodus. She simply moved to the refrigerator, her movements economical and precise, the way someone's hands move when they've been trained to perform surgeries under mortar fire. The ice maker rattled inside the fridge door. She poured water into a paper cup. Drank it standing up. For seconds. Then she was gone again, back into the hallway, back into the controlled chaos of the 3rd floor ER at Mercy General Hospital in Raleigh. That was how it had been for 3 years. They called her Nurse Nobody on the morning shift. She'd heard it twice last week, hadn't bothered correcting them. Correction implied pride in the nickname being false. Silence suggested something worse, that the name fit so well it didn't warrant response. Laura had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was not react to insults. Reaction suggested they mattered. Suggested they landed. Suggested there was something underneath the scrubs and the clipboard and the competent hands that could be wounded. The hands that had held lives together in places where the sand got into everything, your equipment, your wounds, your nightmares. Those hands now checked vitals on a 73-year-old with a GI bleed, heart monitor beeping its steady rhythm, oxygen saturation holding at 94%. The monitor rhythm was clean. Sinus rhythm. Stable. Laura made notes with the kind of precision that suggested either absolute certainty or absolute distance. The patient couldn't tell which. Most people couldn't. The morning shift supervisor, Janet, passed her in the corridor without eye contact. That was the protocol now. See Laura Bennett approaching, pretend urgent business existed elsewhere. The hospital had developed a subtle choreography around her absence from their presence. It wasn't as though anyone had formally decided to freeze her out. It was more like a school of fish responding to a shadow, collective movement, no conversation required. 3 years ago, Laura had walked into this hospital carrying a backpack with 74 days of sobriety from nightmares that woke her screaming, and a battered field journal with pressed desert flowers from Fallujah taped into its pages. The flowers had been collected by someone else, a woman in a different uniform, a different name on her uniform, a woman whose hands performed 17 emergency surgeries in 72 hours outside FOB Falcon while the desert wind carried the sound of small arms fire. That woman's name had been Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. That woman's hands had trembled sometimes when she held her coffee cup because tremors were the physical residue of decisions made under conditions that didn't allow for wrong answers. The civilian version of Laura Bennett had decided that woman needed to disappear completely. Not metaphorically. Not psychologically. Literally. A new city 300 miles from the VA hospital in Durham. A job that required certification but not background verification. A hospital in Raleigh where no one would ask questions because no one would suspect the grey-haired nurse in the back of the ER had spent 5 years holding other people's lives together while her own threatened to fall apart. The plan had worked perfectly until she corrected Dr. Sterling's medication dosage in front of an intern. It had been a simple error, midazolam dose for a pediatric patient at twice the appropriate concentration. The intern, fresh from nursing school and still operating under the assumption that attending physicians were infallible, was preparing to administer it. Laura had looked at the order, looked at the patient's chart, looked at Dr. Sterling's face when she said quietly, "That's double the pediatric protocol for this weight class, doctor. 0.05 milligrams per kilogram. Not 0.10. The intern froze. The medication vial froze in his hands. The entire moment froze in the way that moments do when someone politely suggests that the hierarchy is wrong about something fundamental. Dr. Sterling's face had changed. Not red. Not angry. Something colder than that. Something that made the air pressure shift in a way that reminded Laura's body of incoming mortar fire. The kind of cold that comes from recognizing a threat to authority. She represented everything that threatened his authority: competence without the credential, respect earned through skill rather than purchased with degrees from institutions that cost $200,000. "I'll review the dosage," he'd said to the intern, voice smooth as ice. Then to Laura, not looking at her, "Next time, perhaps consult the chart before questioning clinical judgment." The intern administered the correct dose. The pediatric patient, 6-year-old girl with seizure history, stabilized within minutes. The girl would go home to her mother that evening. No harm done. No crisis. Just a moment where someone had corrected someone, and power had shifted in a way that couldn't be unshifted. After that, the subtle campaign had begun. 2 weeks later, the break room protocol. The reassignments to graveyard shifts, which meant working with skeleton crews and minimal oversight. The whispers, never loud enough to repeat, always loud enough to hear, about credential discrepancies, about whether her nursing degree came from an appropriate institution, about whether she was even really certified or just performing elaborate theater with a clipboard. Dr. Sterling had been playing chess while everyone else thought it was checkers. His moves were strategic, methodical, the work of someone trained to think 3 moves ahead. She knew the type. She'd worked with officers like him, the kind whose competence made their cruelty feel earned. The night shift that stretched toward midnight found Laura alone in Trauma Bay 3, replacing and 4-line on a 48-year-old construction worker with acute pancreatitis. The hiss of air escaping from the tourniquet as she released it. The soft click of the 4-catheter seating properly, 14-gauge, the needle sharp and precise, muscle memory making her hands move with the certainty of someone who'd threaded 1,000 needles under conditions far less forgiving than fluorescent overhead lights. The monitor showed elevated heart rate, blood pressure climbing toward hypertension, inflammation markers probably through the roof, but those results would take time. The construction worker, his name was Dennis, he had a wedding ring and calloused palms, had actually made eye contact with her when she'd introduced herself. "You're good at this," he'd said, watching me go in without bruising. "I've had 3 other nurses miss my veins. You got it first try." She had simply nodded. Said, "Pain management is your priority. Tell me if anything changes." Her voice was quiet. Clinical. The voice of someone who'd learned that warmth invited conversation, and conversation risked revelation. 2 hours later, around 2 in the morning, the 3rd shift had its predictable rhythm. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. Laura moved through the ward like she was made of shadow and competence, checking panels, monitoring vitals, documenting observations. She passed the break room at 2:47 a.m. Through the small window in the door, she saw the graveyard nursing staff clustered together, the tech named Raymond telling some story that made the others laugh. As soon as Raymond glanced up and saw her walking past, the laughter died. He actually turned his back to her, literally rotating his chair away. The conversation resumed, quieter. She didn't break stride. That was the real art of it, the way they'd coordinated their rejection into something so seamless it felt like natural law. Nurse nobody didn't belong in their circle. Nurse nobody worked alone. Nurse nobody was the silent one you whispered about, the competent one who somehow made everyone uncomfortable just by existing in the same room. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the way her hands had finally stopped trembling during coffee breaks. The way the nightmares had started coming less frequently. The way she'd actually begun to think that maybe the invisibility was a fair trade for peace. Maybe being nobody was the price you paid for not having to remember being a senior chief petty officer who'd signed off on combat operations that didn't always end with everybody coming home. Maybe anonymity was mercy. Her shift ended at dawn. Laura clocked out at 6:52 a.m., collected her scrubs from her locker. That was when she caught the edge of the field journal visible inside, the corner of pressed Fallujah flowers just visible before she closed the door too quickly, and walked toward the parking lot where the rain had started falling around 5 a.m. The rain hammered the asphalt like it was trying to wash something away. She drove a grey Nissan, 2014 model, payment $500 per month. In the glove compartment, locked, the field journal waited. She sat in the car for 3 minutes before starting the engine, rain streaming down the windshield, hand steady on the steering wheel because tremors were a luxury she'd surrendered 3 years ago. The Morrison family stood around their father's bed when Dr. Sterling swept into the room with the chart tucked against his chest like a shield. The father, James Morrison, lay pale against the pillows, his cardiac monitor beeping its steady rhythm, a rhythm that had been compromised for 3 days now, his kidneys struggling, his electrolytes a precarious dance between stability and catastrophe. Sterling didn't glance at the monitor. He didn't examine the patient. He ordered the potassium supplement with the casual certainty of a man who had never been wrong, or at least had never been forced to admit it. Laura was checking the fall line when she heard the order. Her hand stilled for exactly 1 second. The fluorescent light above cast everything in pale institutional white, and in that white light, she saw the trajectory of what came next with the same clarity she'd used to calculate blood loss in field tents outside Fallujah. High potassium. Compromised cardiac function. Arrhythmia. Flat line. She stepped forward. Not aggressively. Not with any challenge in her posture. Her voice came out quiet, measured, the voice of someone simply stating a fact. Doctor, his renal function is severely compromised. BUN is 38, creatinine at 2.1. High-dose potassium supplementation in this context creates acute hyperkalemia risk. Sterling's spine straightened. The family watched. 2 interns frozen near the door. Nurse, nobody thinks she knows better than a physician, Sterling said, his voice pitched for the room, for the family, for the interns, not for Laura. Tell me, did you get your medical degree from a correspondence course? Or did you just watch a lot of television? The father's wife flinched. Her daughter looked down at her shoes. Laura's jaw tightened. Just a clench. No tremor. No heat flooding her face. Her stare went flat and cold as winter water, the kind of stare that had looked across interrogation rooms and across the face of command officers who wanted to break her. She'd learned long ago that fury was most dangerous when it was still. When Sterling finished, when he turned back to the chart with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully humiliated a subordinate in front of witnesses, Laura spoke. Her voice hadn't changed. It was still quiet. Still measured. But now it carried the precision of a scalpel. Your ego isn't worth his life, she said. But I'll let you explain that to them when his potassium stops his heart. She turned and walked out while Sterling sputtered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, his face flushing with the rage of a man unaccustomed to being corrected by someone he decided was beneath him. The family stared after her. One of the interns whispered something to the other. Sterling's hands clenched on the chart hard enough that his knuckles went white. They didn't know what she'd done under enemy fire. They didn't know that she'd made similar calls in a field hospital outside Fallujah with mortars landing close enough that the concussion rattled equipment off shelves, and she'd been right every single time. They didn't know that 3 surgeons and a chaplain had written her name in their personal journals as the reason they were still alive. The break room exile began the next morning. Laura entered at 0630 with her lunch container and sat at the empty table near the window. 4 nurses stood immediately, coffee cups in hand, conversations dissolving mid-sentence into pointed silence as they filed out toward the other end of the break room. One of them, a nurse named Patricia who'd actually been friendly before the Sterling situation, whispered nobody loud enough to ensure Laura heard it. She ate alone. Hand steady. Eyes on the wall calendar showing a medical conference in Charlotte that nobody had invited her to attend. The controlled anger burned cold beneath her skin, not hot but cold, the kind of anger that came from years of learning to survive by making yourself small enough to be invisible. She finished her sandwich. She drank her water. She threw away her container. She clocked back in and returned to the floor where Dr. Sterling was rounding, and when he saw her, he smiled. The smile of a man winning a war he'd started without warning. 3 days later, a formal notice appeared on the unit board. The paper was official hospital letterhead, printed in a font designed for gravity. It read, Laura Bennett, insubordination and creating a hostile work environment. Final warning. Beneath her name were 14 signatures. 14 staff members who'd been approached, who'd been made to understand that associating with her was a liability, who'd signed away her reputation for the promise of not being Sterling's next target. Sterling had been strategic about it. That was what made it worse than simple bullying. He'd gathered the signatures carefully, spoken to each person individually, reminded them of their own vulnerabilities, the nurse with the student loan debt, the tech with the custody battle pending, the aide whose shift schedule depended entirely on Sterling's goodwill. He'd made cooperation look like survival. Laura read the notice with the same frozen expression she'd worn in front of the Morrison family. Then she removed it from the board and walked directly to the break room where Dr. Sterling sat with 2 interns, teaching them something about medication intervals that he was getting slightly wrong. This documentation, Laura said, her voice still quiet but now carrying something else beneath it, not anger but something colder, the voice of someone with nothing left to lose, required more effort than your actual patient care. She placed the paper on the table in front of him and left before anyone could respond. Sterling's face went pale. One of the interns looked at her departing back with an expression that might have been respect or might have been fear. She couldn't tell anymore which was which. The systematic destruction accelerated after that. Sterling weaponized the scheduling system, reassigning her to the worst shifts, double shifts on weekends, overnight ICU coverage when staffing was minimal, graveyard rotations that isolated her from the day teams where collaborative learning happened. He restricted her access to mentorship rounds, removed her from the specialty case discussions, ensured she worked in professional quarantine, her competence deliberately prevented from becoming visible. A patient came in with a complex electrolyte disorder on her shift. Laura stabilized him, caught what another nurse would have missed, prevented a crisis. Sterling arrived the next morning, read the notes, and reassigned the patient to another floor without explanation. No recognition. No acknowledgement. Just erasure. Another case, a post-operative patient showing early signs of sepsis. Laura flagged the attending, recommended for antibiotics before the infection progressed. The infection didn't progress because she'd caught it early. Sterling documented it as routine nursing observation, as if anyone could have noticed, as if it required no experience, no intuition, no knowledge purchased with years of standing in operating rooms where people died if you were wrong. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence. The break room now cleared the moment she sat down, conversations resuming only after she left. Nurses who'd once asked for her help began working around her, requesting other assignments rather than shift overlap with her. The message was clear: associate with her and you'd be marked too. Invisibility could be imposed, not just chosen. It was 0100 hours when the ambulance bay doors burst open and everything changed. Paramedics wheeled in an unconscious male, mid-50s, head trauma severe enough that blood matted the right side of his face. No wallet. No identification. Just a man with no name rolling into Mercy General's trauma bay at the worst possible hour. Laura took point on intake before anyone could assign it. Her hands moved with the muscle memory of 1,000 emergencies, the kind of muscle memory that came from operating on the edge of survival. Airway first, she secured it with a size 7.5 endotracheal tube, the passage of it smooth and practiced. Breathing stabilized. 2 liters in through the femoral line before the second fall was even in place. Her movements were efficient, economical, every gesture serving purpose. While cutting away the civilian jacket, a button-up shirt stained with blood and rain, she found them tangled against his chest. Dog tags. Military issue. And the name stamped in the metal made her blood turn to ice. Cole Marcus Wainwright. U.S. Army. Her hand stilled. Not trembling. Still. The moment stretched like taffy, 3 seconds that contained a lifetime. Marcus Wainwright, the presiding officer who had sat across from her 4 years ago in a sparse office at Fort Bragg, who had listened while she admitted she could no longer distinguish between enemy combatants and terrified children's faces in her nightmares, who had signed the paperwork accepting her court-martial resignation with an expression that suggested he understood but couldn't save her anyway. The man who had ended her military career with a pen stroke now lay dying under her hands. She pocketed the dog tags without logging them. Listed him as John Doe on the chart. Pulled up his vital signs on the monitor and made the calculation she'd made 1,000 times before: blood pressure stable but declining, oxygen saturation holding at 94%, heart rate elevated but regular. Survivable. If the next 6 hours went right. If someone kept him alive. Dr. Sterling appeared at the trauma bay entrance, glanced at the unconscious patient with the indifference of a man assessing inventory, and declared him stable enough for observation. He assigned her to ICU monitoring through the night shift, the worst assignment, alone, without backup, the kind of assignment that happened when you were being punished. "Of course, Doctor," Laura said. She said nothing else because nothing else needed saying. She recognized the assignment for what it was. She also recognized that she was about to spend the next 8 hours alone with the man who had destroyed her life, responsible for keeping him alive, her competence locked away in silence while she monitored his heart rate and watched his vital signs like a woman watching a ticking clock. At 0100, she sat beside Wainwright's bed in the ICU, the monitors beeping the only sound in the darkness. His face was familiar and strange at once, older, marked by time and command and the weight of decisions made at the highest levels. His right leg showed early signs of swelling beneath the sheet. Just slight edema, barely noticeable, the kind of thing a tired nurse might miss. Laura didn't miss things. She examined the leg carefully, pressing her fingers against the skin and feeling the firmness that shouldn't have been there. The tissue was becoming congested, fluid accumulating, pressure building with nowhere to go. It was still early. Still salvageable. But it was moving toward something, toward compartment syndrome, toward tissue death, toward the kind of crisis that required someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. She set the monitor to full alert and went back to the nursing station to check his labs. His potassium was 5.2. Elevated. His kidney function was compromised. His body was beginning to accumulate the toxins it couldn't filter. And as she sat there in the fluorescent glare of the ICU at 2 in the morning, with Dr. Sterling sleeping in his office and the hospital quiet enough to hear the rain hammering the windows outside, she understood what was about to happen. The man who had ended her career was about to give her the opportunity to save his life. The question was whether she would. The ambulance bay doors burst open at 2100 hours like a thunderclap through Mercy General's night shift. The paramedics wheeled in a stretcher carrying a man in his mid-50s, his face swollen purple from blunt force trauma, blood matting his silver hair. No wallet. No phone. No identification of any kind. Laura Bennett was at the trauma bay entrance, her scrub still pristine, her eyes already calculating the injuries before they'd even transferred him to the bed. "What do we have?" she asked the lead paramedic, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Found him unconscious on the overpass at mile marker 47. Hit and run, we think. GCS score of 8. Agonal respirations for the first 20 minutes, then he came back on his own." Laura's hands were already moving, peeling back eyelids, checking pupil response. 1 blown. 1 reactive. That meant intracranial bleeding, pressure building inside his skull like a bomb with a timer nobody could see. She'd seen this exact scenario in Fallujah 100 times over, watched young soldiers deteriorate in the seconds between assessment and intervention. The smell of copper and antiseptic merged in the trauma bay as the nursing team positioned monitors around the unconscious patient. 2 large-bore 4s. Push saline wide open. Get a CT of his head, chest, and abdomen. I need a full trauma panel, CBC, type and cross-match for 6 units. Her voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The team moved without hesitation. She was cataloguing the patient's belongings when her fingers snagged on something metallic tangled in the fabric of his jacket lining. Dog tags. Military issue. She pulled them free, turned them over in the fluorescent light, and the blood drained from her face so fast she felt the pressure change in her ears like she was descending into deep water. Colonel Marcus Wainwright. The room didn't spin. Laura's training wouldn't allow it. Her vision simply sharpened, zeroed in on those 3 words engraved in steel, and her entire body went rigid with the kind of stillness that comes from having already survived the worst. She slipped the tags into her pocket, her movements deliberate and controlled. Nobody noticed. Nobody was looking at the night shift nurse holding a piece of her past in her trembling, no. Not trembling. Steady. Absolutely steady hands. This was the man who had signed the papers ending her career. The presiding officer of her court-martial after she admitted under oath that the screams in her nightmares no longer distinguished between enemy combatants and the terrified faces of children. He'd accepted her resignation with the kind of sympathetic nod that meant he understood the choice and respected it, even as his signature made it official. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett was no longer military. She was nobody now. Just a nurse. And now he was unconscious on her trauma bay, his survival dependent on her expertise, and he had no idea who she was. The CT came back at 22:47. Subdural hematoma on the right side, brainstem compression, herniation imminent. The neurosurgeon would be 23 minutes out from his house in Chapel Hill. The patient's pressure was climbing, the intracranial pressure reading hitting 32, then 35. Wainwright's pupils were both starting to dilate. The clock was running backward into death, and every second felt like a knife. Laura stabilized him, positioned his head midline to improve venous drainage, ordered mannitol and hyperventilation to drop the ICP. Her hands moved through the familiar choreography of critical care, each action economical and precise. She was thinking in overlapping layers, the immediate crisis, the surgery that would follow, the 43 times she performed a fasciotomy in field tents outside Fallujah where the electrical grid ran on generators and antibiotics came in ration pouches. Here at Mercy General, they had everything. Sterile equipment. Blood banks. Anesthesiologists on call. And still the system moved like it was underwater. By 01:21, Wainwright's vital signs had stabilized slightly, not improved, just less catastrophic. The neurosurgeon was en route. Laura was adjusting the ventilator settings, watching his oxygen saturation climb from 91 to 94% when she noticed his right leg. It had swollen to nearly twice its normal size in the past 40 minutes. The skin was tight, stretched, discolored a deep burgundy that meant the pressure inside the compartment was crushing blood vessels, suffocating muscle tissue. Compartment syndrome. The tissue damage wouldn't be reversible if this went on much longer. 20 minutes. 30 at most. She felt the old knowledge rise in her chest like muscle memory, the emergency fasciotomy protocol, the specific sequence of cuts, the pressure release that would hiss like air escaping a balloon. She'd done this procedure in tents lit by chemical glow sticks. She could do it in her sleep. She paged Dr. Sterling at 0145. Patient Doe requires immediate fasciotomy. Compartment syndrome progressing. Right leg, tissue necrosis imminent. Nothing. She waited 3 minutes, watching the leg swell another quarter inch, then paged again at 0152. Critical window closing. Patient will lose the leg in 30 minutes without surgical intervention. Still nothing. The charge nurse, Janet, looked at Laura with concern written across her face. He's not answering his pages. Do you want me to call his cell? Do it. Janet dialed. Sterling picked up on the third ring. Laura could hear his voice through the phone, thick and irritated, slurring slightly. He'd been drinking. I'll assess the patient in the morning, he said, and hung up before Janet could finish her sentence. Laura stood at the bedside, watching the monitors trace their sinews patterns across the screen. Heart rate steady. Blood pressure holding. But the leg was darkening, the tissue inside the compartment asphyxiating in real time, and she had made a choice the moment those dog tags touched her palm. She opened the surgical supply cabinet. Opened it with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing you're walking off a cliff and choosing to do it anyway. Her gloves snapped on, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet ICU. The fasciotomy tray was where it always was. Scalpel, hemostats, retractors, sterile drapes. She prepped Wainwright's leg with betadine, her hands moving with the muscle memory of for combat deployments, 3 tours in Fallujah, 17 emergency surgeries in 72 hours where the alternative to action was death. The procedure was simple in structure, impossible in its stakes, a single incision through skin and fascia to release the pressure before the tissue died. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sterling had orchestrated this perfectly. The night shift isolation. The poisoned reputation. The unanswered pages creating a paper trail that would prove she'd warned him, documented the emergency, given him every opportunity to respond as the responsible physician on call. If she moved now, if she picked up that scalpel and made the first incision, she was no longer following protocol. She was no longer a nurse following orders. She was a physician performing surgery without a license, and Sterling had positioned her so thoroughly that any action she took would be the exact ammunition he needed to destroy her completely. The door to the ICU was locked. The only witness was an unconscious colonel who had once ended her military career and now lay dying because a man with authority and a vendetta had chosen negligence as a weapon. Laura looked at Wainwright's face, still unconscious, still unaware of who she was, and then at the scalpel in her hand. The metal caught the light like a tiny mirror reflecting back 17 years of medical expertise, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Navy commendations, a security clearance, a life she'd buried so deeply that even she sometimes forgot it existed. She could hear the ventilator's mechanical wheeze, steady and rhythmic, the sound of a man still alive but running out of time. Her hands knew exactly what to do. They'd known since the moment she saw those dog tags. The scalpel was cool against her palm, perfectly balanced, waiting for the decision she'd already made the second she realized who was on this stretcher. She cleaned the surgical field one more time, her movements methodical, purposeful, completely steady. Then she positioned the blade at the first marked line on his thigh, took one breath, and made the choice that would change everything. The scalpel cut through tissue at 0203 with the precision of muscle memory older than her civilian identity. For compartments. For incisions. Each one releasing pressure that had built toward permanent paralysis, toward gangrene, toward amputation. Laura's hands moved with the terrible fluid grace of someone who had performed this exact procedure under mortar fire in field tents outside Fallujah, where the only difference between saving a limb and losing one was steady hands and 20 minutes. Fluid expelled from the swollen tissue. Copper-colored and urgent. She monitored the monitors, heart rate steady, oxygen saturation holding at 94%, while her blade worked with surgical confidence that belonged to someone with a rank. Not a name tag that said Nurse Bennett. Not credentials that fit the civilian world. But hands that had held lives together when the alternative was watching them slip away. The tissue pinked up immediately as blood flow returned. Viable. Salvageable. The kind of clinical victory that meant nothing to anyone but the patient and the person holding the knife. She closed the first compartment with absorbable suture, each knot placed with the efficiency of someone who had practiced on wounded soldiers in the dark, who understood that speed and precision were the only things standing between recovery and catastrophe. The ICU hummed around her, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm, for pumps clicked in metronomic succession, but Laura existed in a pocket of absolute focus. Her world had compressed to a 6-inch surgical field and the knowledge that if she hesitated, if her concentration fractured for even one moment, Colonel Marcus Wainwright would lose his leg. The same Colonel Wainwright who had accepted her court-martial resignation 3 years ago. The same man who had destroyed everything she'd built in uniform, and whom she was now saving with skills that uniform had given her. She closed the second compartment. Then the third. Her breathing remained controlled, her movements economical. She wasn't thinking about Dr. Sterling. She wasn't thinking about the retaliation that would come. She was thinking about tissue perfusion and viable muscle and the fact that this man's body was responding to her intervention the way textbooks said it would when you relieved compartment pressure before the point of no return. The fourth and final compartment sealed at 0222. She had been in Wainwright's thigh for 19 minutes. The monitors showed a patient stable enough to survive the next phase of recovery, assuming no complications, assuming the fasciotomy sites didn't become infected, assuming someone competent continued the care she had started. That was the moment the ICU door opened. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway, his face cycling through expressions like someone watching film footage of his own powerlessness. Shock first. Then fury. Then something colder and far more dangerous, calculation. He was silent for 6 full seconds, which was the moment Laura understood she had made a choice that could never be unmade, that the only question now was how comprehensively he would destroy her in response. He pulled out his phone. His voice remained level and clinical as he dialed, as though he were ordering lab tests instead of triggering the final sequence of her employment termination. "We have a staff member performing surgery without a license," he said to whoever answered. He hung up. Made another call. Then another. Each conversation identical in its measured tone. Each one another nail in a coffin she had built with her own hands. "Don't move from this room," he told her, and the words were a command, not a request. Not the direction of a superior to a subordinate, but the warning of a predator who had finally decided to attack. Laura said nothing. Her composure was absolute, not the fragile control of someone barely holding together, but the terrifying calm that comes from understanding that you have already survived worse than anything a hospital administrator can do to you. She had survived Fallujah. She had survived watching colleagues die. She had survived 3 years of erasing herself from her own life. Whatever came next was geography. 20 minutes later, Dr. Sterling returned with the night administrator and 2 security guards. His face had settled into an expression of satisfied righteousness, the look of a man who had successfully weaponized institutional policy against someone he hated. He gestured toward his office. It wasn't a request. The office was cold and sterile. Framed certificates on the walls, all of them his accomplishments, Laura noticed. No evidence that other people worked in this hospital. No evidence that medicine was anything except the personal achievement of one ambitious man. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately," Dr. Sterling said, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in his mind 100 times, relishing it. "You have practiced medicine without a license and endangered patient welfare. You will surrender your credentials and badge to security before you leave the premises." Laura removed her badge from around her neck. It was heavier than it should have been. She placed it on his desk. The plastic was still warm from her body. "Do you have anything to say?" he asked, and the question was a trap. Anything she said would be an admission. Anything she said would confirm his version of events for the witnesses he had brought. So she said nothing. She simply looked at him with the flat, frozen stare of someone who had stared down worse men in harder circumstances. His satisfaction flickered. For just an instant, he needed her to react. He needed tears or anger or the trembling of a woman whose career was being destroyed in a small office in Raleigh, North Carolina. He needed her to flinch. He needed to see that his power had landed, that his destruction had struck true. She gave him nothing. Her face was a mask so perfect it should have frightened him, because that kind of composure doesn't come from management seminars or hospital policy. It comes from places where showing fear meant dying, where control was the only currency that mattered. The security guards escorted her out. Past the nurses' station where every single colleague suddenly became intensely focused on paperwork and computer screens. Past the ICU where Colonel Wainwright was recovering from surgery performed by a woman who no longer technically had the right to exist in this building. Past the emergency department where she had once been part of something, before Dr. Sterling had decided her competence was a threat to his authority. The parking lot was dark. Rain had begun falling, not a drizzle, but a hard, punishing rain that drummed against the asphalt like applause for her own exit. She sat in her car for exactly 3 minutes without moving, without crying, without allowing herself anything except the knowledge that she had saved Wainwright's life. She had prevented amputation. She had done what only she could do. Then she drove to Durham. The Veterans Affairs Hospital waiting room smelled like artificial lemon and something underneath it, the particular scent of men and women carrying war in their bodies, a smell Laura recognized because she was wearing it. She filled out intake paperwork with hands that didn't shake. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, 14 years of service, deployed to Iraq 3 times, medical discharge under contested circumstances, current employment status, unemployed as of 2,300 hours. The paperwork asked about suicidal ideation. She checked the box that meant no, which was technically true. She had no intention of killing herself. She had every intention of ceasing to exist, which was different. She had done it once already when she'd put on civilian scrubs and told herself that no one needed to know about Fallujah or combat operations or the weight of making life-and-death decisions in places where death was coming regardless. She was holding the completed form when her phone rang. Unknown number. Washington, D.C. area code. Senior Chief Bennett. The voice was clipped, military, official. This is Colonel Morrison from Walter Reed. We need you to return to Mercy General immediately. There's been a development with your patient. 3 words should not have been enough to change everything. But they were. I don't have a patient, Laura said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, the voice of someone who had surrendered her identity at a hospital office door. I was terminated. We know. Return to Mercy General now. This is not a request. The line went dead. Laura looked at the pressed desert flowers in her field journal, still dried and preserved after 3 years. She had kept them in her locked car specifically because she couldn't bear to throw them away and couldn't bear to look at them either. A soldier had given them to her outside a medical tent in Fallujah, a young private with a punctured lung and 3 minutes to live if her hands didn't do the exact right thing. She had saved him. He had pressed flowers from somewhere beautiful and left them for her as thanks. She had saved Wainwright tonight the same way. 3 days had passed since Sterling terminated her employment, 3 days of silence so complete it felt like the whole city had conspired to forget she existed. Laura sat in the VA hospital waiting room in Durham, the registration paperwork trembling in her hands, not from fear, but from the weight of finally admitting something she'd spent 5 years running from. Around her, young veterans with combat eyes stared at nothing, their shoulders curved inward like soldiers still flinching from mortars that had stopped firing years ago. A kid who couldn't have been more than 23 sat across from her, his leg bouncing so fast it rattled the plastic chair. Another veteran wore his service dog vest over a frame so thin his sternum showed through his t-shirt. She recognized herself in every hollow stare. Recognized what she'd been trying to outrun since she'd traded Fallujah for antiseptic hallways. The intake coordinator had handed her a clipboard. The questions were simple. Previous military service. Rank. Theater of operations. Combat-related trauma. Substance use. Suicidal ideation. She'd filled in the first 5 lines in steady handwriting, each word a small surrender. Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2006 through 2011. Combat Surgical Team. 17 surgeries in 72 hours. 0 preventable fatalities. The numbers were precise, clinical, untouched by the nightmares that had shattered her sleep since the day her hands had started shaking so badly she couldn't hold a scalpel anymore. The field journal locked in her car, pressed desert flowers brittle as ghosts, was the only evidence that those 72 hours had been real. She was halfway through the question about PTSD symptom severity when her phone rang. Unknown number. Washington prefix. Her instinct, honed through years of military discipline, was to silence it, to finish the intake form, to finally accept help she couldn't reach on her own anymore. But something made her answer. Something that remembered she'd once been a person who responded immediately to orders. Senior Chief Bennett. This is Colonel Morrison from Walter Reed. We need you to return to Mercy General immediately. There's been a development with your patient. His voice was clipped, professional, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Her throat tightened. Colonel Wainwright isn't my patient anymore. He is now. You have 1 hour. The line went dead. She sat in the waiting room for 30 seconds, the registration form still trembling in her hands, then stood and walked out without finishing a single line. The VA intake coordinator called after her. Laura didn't turn around. Muscle memory took over, the same response that had gotten her off Fallujah streets when the mortars started falling, the same instinct that had made her move toward danger when everyone else moved away. Mercy General's ambulance bay erupted at exactly 1400 with the sound of diesel engines and hydraulic brakes. 3 black SUVs cut through the parking lot like sharks scenting blood, military precision in every inch of their movement. The doors opened in synchronized sequence, disgorging 2 Army Rangers in dress uniforms so sharp they looked like they'd been cut from photographs. Their bearing was unmistakable, the way they moved through space as if it belonged to them, the way their eyes catalogued every exit, every threat, every vulnerability. Rangers. 160th saw, if her read was correct. She'd worked alongside operators like these in the desert. She knew their language before they spoke. They walked directly to the ICU without stopping at reception. Nurses scattered like birds. Hospital staff stepped aside instinctively, recognizing authority written in posture. Laura watched from a supply room doorway, still in civilian clothes, her hair loose around her shoulders, everything about her appearance screaming she no longer belonged here. "We're looking for a nurse." "Call sign Phantom," one of the Rangers said to the charge nurse. His name tape read Holloway. His voice carried the weight of someone used to being answered immediately. The charge nurse's face went blank. "I'm sorry. We don't have anyone by that. Get me Laura Bennett." "Phantom 6. The voice came from the ICU bay, hoarse but clear. Colonel Wainwright's eyes had opened. His recovered leg lay straight beneath the blanket, the pressure released, the tissue saved. He was looking directly at the doorway where Laura stood, and his expression held recognition so profound it seemed to shift the air in the room. The charge nurse spun toward her, eyes widening. She was reaching for the phone before Laura had time to move. Holloway turned. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second, the kind of recognition that passes between people who have stood in the same fire. Then he nodded, a single sharp acknowledgement, and stepped aside. The Marine Lieutenant Colonel entered the ICU holding a leather folder embossed with official seals. He began reading from it in a voice that didn't ask permission, didn't need it. Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, Favela under fire during Operation Iraqi Freedom, Fallujah sector, where she performed 17 combat surgeries in 72 consecutive hours with 0 preventable fatalities. He paused between each sentence, letting the weight of them settle, resulting in the preservation of life under fire. For tactical decision-making that exceeded her chain of command's expectations. For the kind of courage that saves nations. Dr. Sterling appeared then, his face the color of antiseptic solution. He stepped into the ICU doorway, gathering the shreds of his authority. "This woman was terminated for protocol violations and has absolutely no business." The Marine continued without acknowledging him. His voice never wavered. For extraordinary heroism in the face of hostile enemy fire. For the kind of sacrifice that defines. "I said she doesn't work here anymore." Sterling's voice cracked like breaking ice. But then a 2-star general stepped forward, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. His uniform was immaculate, his hair military cut, his bearing the kind that came from 30 years of command. He looked at Sterling for exactly 2 seconds, the kind of look that made admirals weep, then turned toward Laura. His hand rose to his forehead in a crisp salute, the gesture so precise it sounded like a gunshot in the silence. "Senior Chief, the Pentagon sends their regards. Colonel Wainwright's recovery has been classified as critical to Operation Sandstone. Your field journal was retrieved from your vehicle by his security detail this morning. He'd like to return it personally and discuss your reinstatement to active duty status with full back pay and rank restoration." Sterling's face went from white to purple. His mouth opened. He stepped forward, not toward the general, but toward the hallway, toward the security office, toward a computer terminal where he could still salvage this, where he could still erase the evidence of his negligence. He had no idea the Navy veteran IT administrator was already watching. Jake Chen had recognized the significance of dog tags the moment Laura had logged the John Doe into the system. He'd worked on the USS Ronald Reagan for 8 years. He knew military protocol. He knew what it meant when a comatose patient carried the identification of a high-ranking officer. The moment Sterling had terminated Laura, Jake had made his choice. He'd backed up every frame of security footage from the night of the fasciotomy, all 17 minutes of it, in 4K resolution, with timestamps visible on every single second. The timeline was damning. Laura's pages at 0145 and 0152. Sterling's dismissive phone response at 0156. Her 21-minute emergency fasciotomy that stopped the pressure, that saved the leg, that preserved Colonel Wainwright's mobility. Sterling's 24-minute delayed arrival, his immediate termination of the woman who had just saved his life. Every single second documented. Every single frame preserved. Jake had compiled a 17-page analysis. Medical board standards for response time, 10 minutes. Emergency protocols for compartment syndrome, immediate decompression. Negligent delay window, anything over 15 minutes. Sterling's delay, 24 minutes. The documentation of his systematic harassment, emails requesting her reassignment, recorded voice messages calling her a liability, the fabricated write-up posted on the unit board. All of it preserved. All of it archived. All of it forwarded to the state medical board with a cover letter that read, "Calculated negligence and systematic harassment of a military veteran by a senior physician. Evidence of deliberate interference with patient care." Sterling discovered the problem when 2 state medical board investigators arrived at Mercy General with legal documentation and a warrant for his personal devices. They requested his immediate presence in his office and asked him to unlock his computer. His fingers moved toward the keyboard, not to cooperate, but to delete. But the machine was already locked. The deletion attempt triggered an automatic notification to the investigators. The error message appeared, "Access denied, files backed up to external server." The room went so quiet you could hear his breathing stop. The lead investigator opened her folder. Inside were copies of everything. The backup emails. The timeline. The footage. The records of his calls to hospital administrators and board members, all of which now looked like deliberate obstruction of care. The systematic isolation he'd orchestrated, documented through scheduling records and staff testimony. The dismissive way he'd spoken to Laura in front of the Morrison family, recorded in 3 different witness statements. His strategic competence finally manifested in self-preservation. He realized in that moment that he couldn't delete his way out of this. That the woman he'd tried to destroy had been protected by something far more powerful than his administrative authority. She'd been protected by the people who understood what it meant to sacrifice everything. His phone calls to board members went unanswered. His emails requesting support bounced back unread. The hospital administrator, who had signed off on Laura's termination just 72 hours earlier, now refused to meet with him. The investigation lasted for months. The results were unambiguous. Patient endangerment through negligent delayed response. Systematic workplace harassment. Falsification of performance documents. Professional misconduct. His medical license was suspended pending investigation, a process that would take at least 18 months. Plea negotiations were offered. He took them, which meant accepting responsibility while trying to minimize exposure. 6 months later, Dr. Sterling stood in the basement of Raleigh Community College teaching CPR certification courses for $15 an hour to adults who'd never heard of him, who didn't care that he'd once held the power to destroy careers. He demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic mannequin whose rubber skin never flinched, never resisted, never required him to apologize. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn above linoleum floors scarred by decades of feet. His students looked at him with expressions that ranged from indifference to mild contempt. One woman asked if he'd ever actually saved a life himself. He couldn't answer. Meanwhile, at Walter Reed Medical Center, Laura Bennett stood in dress uniform, senior chief petty officer insignia polished to mirror brightness, decorations displayed across her chest like a language only the military could read. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. Navy Cross. The medals gleamed under the hospital lights as she pinned the same insignia onto a young combat medic who had just returned from her first deployment, whose hand still shook, whose eyes carried the weight of things that shouldn't have to be witnessed by 22-year-old women. Colonel Wainwright watched from his wheelchair, his recovered leg crossing beneath him with ease, the scars from her fasciotomy thin white lines that looked like they'd been drawn with a surgeon's precision. Behind Laura's new desk at the medical center, an office in the Naval Medicine Readiness Division, a shadow box displayed her field journal with its pressed desert flowers from Fallujah, no longer a burden to hide, no longer something she carried as a secret shame. The flowers were brittle and golden now, almost transparent, and they rested on the journal's open pages like evidence of a life she'd finally accepted as her own. Young sailors and soldiers came to see her, the ones struggling with reintegration, the ones whose hands shook too badly to hold a scalpel anymore, the ones who'd seen things that made civilian medicine feel impossible. They sat across from her desk and watched her trace a finger along one of those pressed flowers. "How did you handle coming back?" a young medic asked, the same question they all asked in different words. Laura met her eyes with understanding earned through years of nightmares and isolation, through 5 years of running, through 3 days in a VA waiting room surrounded by ghosts wearing uniforms. "I stopped running from who I was," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave since her nursing days. It carried authority now, the kind that came from having already survived the worst and learned to build from the wreckage. "I found people who understood that silence isn't weakness. It's survival. And then I found people I could teach." She smiled then, barely, the kind of expression that meant everything. The quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. The young medic nodded, and something in her shoulders unclenched. If you found yourself rooting for Laura tonight, if you felt that satisfaction when Sterling's careful deletions hit a locked server, I want to hear from you. Subscribe to this channel and leave a comment. Tell me about a time you were underestimated, a time someone looked at your quiet competence and completely missed what you could do. We've got more stories like this one coming, more tales of people whose silence masks something extraordinary. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one.